Hi guys! This month we're going to talk all about drawing cartoony hands. Hands can be quite overwhelming, and to be fair, they are one of the hardest things to draw because they can take so many different forms. For example, notice when you reach for something and your hand would naturally take the shape of the object. This is precisely what makes drawing hands so challenging. However, breaking them down to basic geometric shapes makes the whole thing a lot easier, and this is one of the things that we're going to do today. First, we'll talk about the basic proportions and anatomy, how the bones and muscles work. I'll show you how I simplify the hands and group some of the shapes to make them easier to draw. I'll talk about stylization and simplification, and I'll show you how I draw different types of hands. For example, skinny, chubby, male, female, and so on. And then I will give you 8 tips for drawing hands in different positions and from different angles, because this is one of the hardest parts. And lastly, I will share with you some helpful books and exercises that have helped me improve a lot, and I think they will be a great way for you to practice what you've learned in this tutorial. Okay, we have a lot to unpack, so let's get started now. Let's go over the basic proportions of the hand real quick before we dive into the anatomy and stylization. So first we have the palm of the hand, and to simplify, you can think of it as a little house shape, only it's a little bit offset, so the top is more to one side. The highest point of the roof would be the middle of the middle finger, and your middle finger is about the same length as the palm of your hand. The index and ring fingers are usually the same length, but not with everyone. For example, mine aren't. My index finger is a little bit shorter, and I once googled it to find out why, and the article said that if you have it, it means you're a man. So, I guess you never truly know yourself. Okay, notice the nice curvature that the fingers have, with the middle finger obviously being the longest. Remember that knuckles will follow the same curve as the fingertips. As for the thumb, I like to add this triangle to the side of the house as it helps with the structure, and it would take about 2/3 of the length of the palm. Okay, now let's take a look at the skeleton and how the bones work. In the real world, each human finger consists of 3 little bones or segments, the green, yellow, and red rectangles here. According to Google Translate's voice, this thing is called a phalange, although I really want to call it a phalange, but I guess that's incorrect, so we're gonna go with a phalange for now. Okay, so 3 segments on each finger, with the ones closest to the palm being the longest, then the middle ones being slightly shorter, and the ones that form the tips of your fingers being the shortest. And as for the thumb, we're only going to draw 2 phalanges there because it works a little bit differently than the other guys. Last thing I want to mention here is that the nails usually start around the middle of the 3rd phalange. Alright, now let's take a look at the muscles and tendons of the hand real quick. And first we'll look at the bottom side. You have some muscles in the palm of your hand, but it's very important to remember that there are no muscles in your fingers. You only have tendons there, and they all go through this little tunnel in your wrist called the carpal tunnel and connect to the muscles in your forearm, and this is how you actually move your fingers. And here is the top view. On top of your palm, again, you have tendons connecting to your forearm muscles. These are responsible for stretching out your fingers, and the tendons on the bottom side of your palm are responsible for closing your fingers and forming a fist. But what's important to remember here is that most of the movement comes from your forearm muscles because they do all the work. Now the thumb is a little bit special again because it has its own muscle. I'm not gonna go into great details here again because I don't find it important, but what you need to know is that on the bottom of the palm you have these two big volumes, the thumb muscle on one side and the big fleshy part on the outside of your hand. These are two of the most important components when drawing hands, and especially cartoony ones, because they are incredibly helpful in defining the volume of your hand and also informing the viewer how the hand is positioned in space, but we'll talk more about that later in the video. Alright, I think we covered all of the anatomy basics. Now let's move on to the more exciting part of this tutorial, in which we're going to discuss how to simplify and draw different types of hands. Remember how I told you that all of your 4 fingers consist of 3 phalanx each, with only your thumb having 2? That's true in the real world, but in character design we often simplify the hand by giving only 2 phalanx to each finger. Here's an example of a cartoony hand with 3. It looks alright, but imagine this is the hand of a full body character. That will be a lot of detail in a very small area of the canvas. And here is an example of a hand with only 2 phalanx, much more readable and simple, yet giving you all the needed information for the gesture. So, in this video we're mostly going to draw 2 phalanx for each finger. I've noticed in old 2D Disney movies, for example, that sometimes a character would have 2, and then in another scene they would have 3. I guess it also depends on how close the camera is and so on, but I would say draw 3 only if you really need it for the pose, but if you can get away with 2, definitely draw only 2. Okay, now that you know all of these very important things, let's draw a bunch of different hands. We're gonna start with a standard female hand with gentle long fingers, something between rounded and pointy, I would say, when it comes to the shape language. I'm starting out with this big rectangular shape, and I want a really clean silhouette here, so I will keep the thumb entirely inside the shape of the palm. I indicate its big muscle and draw the 2 phalanx, and to exaggerate the shapes, I elongate the middle and index fingers so they're actually longer than the palm. The ring finger and the pinky I keep very simple for the sake of readability again. I'm just basically drawing them as 2 rectangles, sort of. I don't need to be super accurate with this. My main goal here is just nailing down the gesture and having clear, easy to read shapes. Next, let's draw a male hand. I'm gonna keep the fingers on this one slightly shorter and boxier. You can see that once again I start with the basic geometric shapes. I often like to imagine the hand like an oven mitten because it's really simplified, so I would draw something like that and then slowly carve out the details. Notice how much I simplify the shapes overall. I won't draw all the tiny bumps and corners, only the big ones that contribute to the shape. When you draw fingers overlapping one another, like here, I would suggest you start with the one closest to the camera because otherwise it can get messy and confusing. For this example, I'm going to draw a really boxy male hand with lots of straight corners. I'm indicating the side of the palm and then drawing the fingers. In this case, you can see that the pinky actually has 3 phalanx because I can't get away with only 2 for that pose. I'm indicating the knuckle of the middle finger but grouping all the other ones into a straight line to simplify the silhouette. And I keep everything very angular, so you have the side of the palm, the fingers, the knuckles, the thumb muscle, even the nail is a square. For the last example, I'm going to draw a small chubby hand. It's going to be wider and with shorter fingers. I keep their ends pointy to balance out the fluffiness of the hand and make that stand out more. I'm also drawing this small crease at the wrist, which is a really tiny detail but adds a lot to the drawing. Alright, I think you get how this works. You can play around a lot with proportions and different shapes and all that, but now let's move on to the next chapter in which I'm going to give you 8 tips on drawing hands from different angles and in different poses, because this is really one of the hardest things. Tip number 1, the fan shape. But not this kind of fan, this one. I always start by drawing the house shape that we talked about in the beginning, but instead of this rigid angular shape, I draw the roof of the house as this smooth curved line. And then when adding the fingers, I think of them as a fan, especially when they're spread out like that. It really helps to make them look more harmonious. When drawing this line along the tips of the fingers, I keep in mind that the middle finger is the longest, and also, as we said earlier, that it's actually not positioned in the middle, but slightly to one side. One really important thing that I want you to remember is that no one is holding a gun to your head, forcing you to get things right from the first try. I love drawing hands, but I always mess up the proportions and I keep tweaking them as I refine my drawing, so feel free to do the same and don't get discouraged if you make mistakes or if you get something wrong from the first try. Just remember to look at the bigger picture at all times and not get too caught up in the details. You know those moments when you finally figure out how to draw something that has troubled you for a long time and then your life is never the same anymore? For me, this moment was when I noticed that the front side of the fist doesn't look like a perfect rectangle, but it's sort of like this triangular shape. It may seem like something you don't really need to know, but I can't tell you how many times this little tip has saved me, especially when I have to draw characters holding the strap of their backpack on their shoulder. This is not only true for a fist, but for whenever the hand is slightly closed and the fingers are together. And of course, the logic behind it is related to the first tip about the fingers being shaped like a fan, and it's also related to the curvature of the fingers that we spoke about in the beginning, because the phalanx of the fingers are not all the same length, so this shape happens as a result. Remember the house shape that I mention every 5 seconds in this video? Well, here it is again, but this time in front view. Whenever I struggle with an angle of a hand, I would always draw this box as you see here, and then I would attach the fingers to it. I know it may come naturally to you to want to draw the hands as these flat objects because, well, after all, you can rest your palm flat on a desk, so it only makes sense. But remember that they are quite flexible and they can wrap and bend too. As you can see in this reference, I've completely relaxed my hand, but follow my knuckles and you will see the curvature. This tip is more applicable if you're drawing in a slightly more detailed or semi-realistic style, but I wanted to include it in this tutorial anyway. Apart from the nails and the muscles, there's one more thing that helps us differ between the top and bottom sides of the palm, and this is how the fingers connect to it. If you look at the bottom side of the palm, it will be overlapping the fingers, so you will get these little lines that form there. If you look at the top side though, the fingers will be overlapping the palm, so you would get these triangular shapes instead. When you're drawing cartoony hands, you may skip these details, but if you have a close-up of a hand, or as we said, if you're drawing in a more semi-realistic style, you may want to include these. You should always think about grouping the fingers together whenever you can. Yes, in real life we often have our fingers spread out and relaxed, each doing its own thing, but in character design we avoid doing that because it makes the silhouette look too busy and hard to read, and overall it's just unnecessary work. Let's say your character is reaching to grab a glass of water. Instead of drawing the fingers all spread out, you can group the middle, ring finger and pinky into one shape and only keep the index finger separately. This creates a lot more clarity in your drawing and makes it really easy for the viewer to understand the gesture. And we separate the index finger from the rest just to spice up the silhouette and add some interest and personality. Because if you keep them all together, it may look boring and as if you can't draw hands and you're trying to cheat. You can group the fingers in different ways depending on the story. My favorite one is leaving the pinky out because it adds a lot of character and just looks cute. When you've grouped a few fingers together into one shape, keep in mind that you can omit some detail there to simplify your drawing even further. Instead of drawing the full lines separating each finger from the other, I would sometimes only lightly indicate those. It tends to look a lot cleaner, and our brains are pretty good at identifying patterns, so they would automatically connect the lines and figure out what's the shape. By giving the viewer such little challenges throughout your drawing and giving them some room for interpretation, so to speak, it creates more interest and keeps their attention longer. Let's focus for a little bit on the thumb muscle. the big fleshy part on your palm that looks kinda like a drumstick. Always think of it as a continuation of the thumb finger. I always indicate this muscle because it adds a lot of volume to the drawing. It overlaps with the rest of the palm really nicely when you look at the hand from different angles, and it's a really easy shape to exaggerate and make your silhouette cleaner. Just a little thing to keep in mind, you don't need to perfectly outline this muscle, and in fact you should avoid doing it in most cases because it may look weird in certain angles and too busy. Just lightly indicate its existence and that would be enough. I always pay attention to this muscle as well because it can make your drawings look much more solid. I simply use it to indicate the side of the hand because, well, that's simply what it is. I like to exaggerate its shape if I'm drawing a hand in side view, but not only then, it's just a great way to add more dimension to your drawing and also to indicate how the hand is turned in space. Alright, these were all of the tips that I wanted to share with you. And now in this last chapter of the video, I want to give you some helpful resources and exercise ideas to practice what you've learned so far. One of the most important things you need to begin with is understanding the general structure and proportions of the hand. So this first exercise is really obvious. Take a bunch of pictures of your hands and just redraw them. But keep them realistic in terms of anatomy and proportions in the beginning. Think about the house shape, the muscles, the bones we discussed. Here you can see these wonky old studies I made back in 2016. Far from perfect, but they taught me a lot and I still like to do this exercise whenever I get the chance. The second exercise that has helped me a lot is redrawing stuff from anatomy books. I have this big book by Gottfried Bames with tons of anatomical drawings, and I'd redraw the bones of the hand or the drawings where the muscles are explained and so on. Another book I found really helpful was the Book of 100 Hands. I used to just copy the hands from it, and although they are more realistic and in a more specific style, it also taught me a lot and it made me think more creatively about exaggeration. The third and probably my favorite exercise is redrawing Disney hands. Take an A4 piece of paper or a digital document of that size, pick an old 2D Disney movie and just draw 50 hands from it. The hands of different characters in different angles, holding stuff or just having cool gestures, it doesn't matter. Just remember that variety is your friend here. Drawing 50 hands on the same page will force you to keep them quite small, so you can't really get too caught up in the details, and I strongly advise you to do it like this instead of, one big hand per page. Alright guys, that was it for this video. I really hope that you found it helpful. In the Patreon post below, you're going to find a bonus zip file with some reference pictures of my hands. Feel free to use those to practice and just make some studies of them. Thank you guys so much for supporting me another month. It really means the world to me, and I will see you next time. Bye bye!